I have touched on this topic before several times. Anytime you've heard me talk about how extra attack is a fake feature, this is what I'm talking about. Power budgeting is a thing that happens when you are designing player options. Today, I'm going to be primarily talking about classes because they are big bundles of player options. But this does, to at least some extent, apply to pretty much any player option that can be chosen. Power budgeting. So when you are creating for example, a class, you want to, let's back up a second because I'm making some assumptions here. I'm assuming that you want to make a game that is at least reasonably well balanced. That you want each player option of the same type, those which exist within the same layer, if you will, to be basically equal. Like there isn't one that's definitely better than the others. There isn't a correct choice. So you want them to be comparable. You're going to do that by having an idea in your mind about how powerful those options should each individually be, what they should be able to accomplish, how far they should push the character from featureless up to having this feature. And so now they are able to interact with the game in new and interesting ways and potentially have more power. This is true for a lot of RPGs. It's not going to apply to every RPG because not every RPG is about making more powerful characters. But games like D&D definitely are. So you have all these classes and you say, all right, I've got this power budget in my mind. It probably starts as a pretty vague concept because power is kind of a vague term. It's hard to quantify. But you know kind of how you want them to feel. Aces. So now you have a budget. You know that they need to fit within this power structure, and you need to add in features and new rules that allow them to fill up that budget as close as possible to the budget that you have set. Maybe they're going to go a little bit over, maybe they're going to be a little bit under. It's not that big a deal, as long as they're close. The issue then is that you're going to run into thematics. Theme is often what clashes with mechanics in a way that messes this process up. So let's give an example. The Wizard in 5th edition is their theme is we are the best at magic. We have spell casting, a very powerful tool, and we have all the best spells because we're the best spellcaster. The Wizard, best at spells. That's their identity. And so that class clearly has a bigger power budget than everyone else. Arguably, the Druid is pretty close. But I'm not talking about differences in the size of the budget. Because let's assume that the designers tried to use the same budget for all classes. They emphatically and objectively failed, but let's say that was their goal. Then you have classes like the Monk. Now let's compare the Monk to a more comparable class than the Wizard, because that's a fully different kind of ballgame. You have the Monk is going to be a primarily melee attacker. I know that they actually are decent at ranged attack, and that's probably the more optimal way to play them, but let's do the Monk as intended. It's a melee attacker. You hit with stick, you hit with fist, you do a bunch of attacks, you're dodgy, etc. You know, the Monk. Now we compare them to a fighter who is going to wear armor. Instead of having a feature that gives a bonus to AC, they're going to wear armor that gives them more AC. They are going to hit with weapons, which do more damage. And they're going to have a bunch of features that make them better at those weapons. Well, the Monk has a bunch of features that make them better at unarmed attacks. Now here's where power budgeting gets tricky. Because the Monk is attacking with unarmed strikes and with simple weapons that are not as good as martial weapons. And the fighter is doing martial weapons and wearing armor. And they're both getting kind of close to the same amount of boost to these things. Actually, the fighter does get more of a boost, but let's assume that that has more to do with feats. To be honest, like there's more support for weapons than there are for unarmed attacks. So let's say that they have the same amount of features that do more or less the same amount of boosting to their respective abilities. But the monk started with an unarmed strike. And they have to spend some of their power budget to make that unarmed strike more like a regular weapon. Make it do like a D6 damage or whatever it ends up. I think it starts out at D6. Why are they spending their budget on that? If it costs, let's put it into money terms. Let's say it costs $5 to make your unarmed strike get up to the same as like using a short sword, and another $5 to give you those extra attacks, and another $5 to let you use your dexterity on the unarmed strikes, and another $5. Like you're spending this huge section of the class's power budget to just get up to baseline, what a fighter gets just for having a weapon in hand and putting on armor. You're like, a lot of monk features exist to allow them to operate in this way that is thematically what they're supposed to do. Be the unarmored warrior who uses unarmed strikes. These themes mean that you're starting with extremely suboptimal options and bringing them up to baseline. Whereas the fighter is starting at baseline and getting boosts from there. So when you are determining your power budget, you need to know not only how much you want to push your classes up, but you also need to know where you want them to start. And getting them up to that point, because like there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of the unarmored warrior, the martial artist. Like this is a pretty core fantasy to a lot of narratives. So there's nothing wrong with having it in your game. But you need to understand that like bringing the martial artist up to baseline should not be charged against their power budget. They need to start there. 4th edition did this a lot. There's subclasses, like, so sometimes you'd have a class with like different subclasses that rely on different secondary abilities. So like, let's say you're a charisma, we'll use the sorcerer, for example. They are charisma based, so their attacks go off of charisma, but their subclass, their specialization, would determine what their secondary ability is. And it would either be strength or dexterity. So some subclasses use strength, some subclasses use dexterity. The issue is that AC is a very important stat, and AC cares about dexterity, does not care about strength. So, in order to make those both equally valid options, the strength-based subclasses would, and I've talked about this before, I think I did a whole video on this specific topic. The strength-based subclasses would have an additional feature that lets you use strength for AC instead of dexterity or intelligence. And it was like additional, like, because you could kind of draw one-to-one, like, okay, this feature is kind of equivalent to this feature is kind of equivalent to this feature. But for the strength-based classes, they would have an additional one that lets you do that, because it's important that you have more or less the same AC no matter which subclass you choose. Because if they didn't have that feature there, you'd only ever choose the dexterity-based subclasses, because AC is too important to neglect. So that didn't cost anything out of the sorcerer's power budget. That was like it. You don't charge them for going up from negative up to 0. You know, you start at 0 and then you go up from there. So this is an aspect of power budgeting that a lot of people don't really understand. And so that's why I call extra attack a fake feature, because it is just bringing weapon users up to baseline, because all the spellcasters get it for free. It doesn't count as a feature for them, so it should not count as a feature for marshals. But it does, because it shows up in the feature list for some reason. You don't see, improved cantrips at level 5, 11, and 17 for casters. But if we were being fair, you would, and it would count as their feature for that level. But it doesn't. because the power budgeting is not treated the same for each class. But I mean, it's amazing how many of my videos actually do eventually boil down to like, oh, just marshals have to pay for things that casters get for free. This happens all the time. But for power budgeting specifically, you've got to understand that the point of power budgeting is to bring classes up to being about equal with each other. There's going to be a little bit of variation there. No system is perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Striving for perfection is more effort than it is worth. But getting it close is important. But if you're not looking at where the classes end up, where the end points are, and you're only looking at, well, we gave the monk, out of 20 levels, you have, 25 features. That's more than like the 22 that a marshal gets, and it's way more than like the 15 that a spellcaster gets. Like, that's not the point. Like, number of features isn't a useful metric. And not even like looking at how big of a boost each of those features are. Because like, if you were to boil it down to a number, like how much of a boost does this feature give you, either in absolute terms or in relative terms, that's also irrelevant if you start each class at a different level. The rogue has to use finesse weapons or ranged weapons and has to have advantage in order to use its main damaging feature. That's a factor. That's a limiting factor. And you have to budget accordingly to get up to baseline and then start boosting it the same as you would any other class. Otherwise, the rogue and the monk and the barbarian are all going to get left behind, even to the fighter. And the fighter is getting left behind by all the casters. And this is what happens. You start off with this idea that the casters are going to start off with this boost of spell casting that just ramps up, and they're still going to get the same kind of boosts that you're giving everyone else. And that frustrates me, because that's not the point of power budgeting, and it's misusing the whole idea. Like, I can see when I'm looking at these classes what they were thinking when they add, deflect arrows. Oh, it's so cool. It's a defense against ranged attacks. Well, that's really niche, and it doesn't really, it's not a very big boost, but it does take up a whole, feature for that level. So I feel like the monks are being overcharged for that kind of feature, And the same thing with unarmed or unarmored defense. Like, unarmored defense is a prime example. You have a whole feature that gives you AC comparable to what others have by putting on armor, but it counts as a whole class feature for you. So anyways, power budgeting is tricky. It's useful for building out classes to reach a certain level of power, but it is not in itself a valuable metric for adhering to. It is a tool, not a goal.